The relationship with Russia has taken a new leap. Suddenly, the tension has become once again red hot. The drums of war are beating, and at the highest level, all kinds of warnings about a new phase of the war can be heard, a much more disturbing phase.
The threat of war may not be imminent, but it is not impossible. And the risks of war should not be overblown, but they should be prepared for. And that starts with the urgent need to rebuild, replenish, and modernize member states' armed forces.
Macron says sending Western troops to Ukraine cannot be ruled out. French president also drops opposition to artillery purchases for Kiev from outside the EU.
And Putin, of course, has responded.
Vladimir Putin warns a wider conflict over Ukraine. Russian president makes most explicit threat to use nuclear weapons since full-scale invasion.
But what exactly could explain why we once again seem to be on the brink of the abyss? Why has the tension been ratcheting up once again? Well, this is one of the most important videos we have ever made in the history of VisualPolitik. By the way, if you want us to continue making these kinds of videos, you can give us a hand via our Patreon. And also follow us on Visual Economic. This will help us a lot to move forward with more and better content. The point is that the mainstream media may not be very aware of it, but as you can see in this video, a war on NATO territory could be much closer than we all think. And I'm sure, absolutely certain, that you have all heard these statements.
Would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want.
Would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want.
Indeed. The former US president said loud and clear that if he were to return to the Oval Office, he would not defend Europe against a Russian attack. He even said he would applaud or encourage Putin if he did ultimately decide to attack. But wait a minute, is this just electoral tomfoolery, or is there more to it? Why are so many analysts taking these statements extremely seriously? What would be the consequences of the United States abandoning its NATO commitments? VisualPolitik community, pay close attention to this video, because we are going to explain to you many of the things that are not being mentioned about the implications of the war in Ukraine, and also about what Donald Trump's return to the White House could mean. The first scenario you are about to see is the nightmare that frightens many analysts and military experts in the old continent right now, especially in the former Warsaw Pact countries, which, let's face it, know the Russians particularly well. The year is 2026. Trump is in the second year of his second presidency. Ukraine is still struggling, but Western aid has been reduced to dribs and drabs. The front lines are frozen, and suddenly Trump keeps his word. He announces that the United States will no longer honor its NATO commitments. It is even beginning to withdraw troops from European territory to focus on the Chinese threat in the Indo-Pacific. Then, at that precise moment, Vladimir Putin sees his great opportunity. Overnight in Estonia, an incident occurs, a false flag action against the Russian-speaking population. Moscow is outraged, and thousands of non-uniformed men infiltrate Estonia. Chaos spreads, the Kremlin's denunciations escalate, and before long, missiles begin to fall on the Amari air base, which is where NATO has its air surveillance force deployed in Estonia. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of units from the Leningrad military district are pouring in with tanks and mobile artillery systems on the small Estonian Republic. Supposedly, they are doing so to protect the Russian-speaking population that is being persecuted. Does this reasoning ring any bells? I'm sure it does. It is already a tried and true formula in the Kremlin's foreign policy. But let's move on. Russian troops are facing only about 10,000 Estonian troops and a few thousand reinforcements from NATO countries. At that moment, in order to prevent a possible large-scale response, Putin covers his back and threatens to use his nuclear arsenal if any country attacks Russian territory. He directly targets cities such as Warsaw, Stockholm, and Berlin. In a matter of days, Russian troops control eastern Estonia, starting with Narva. That part of the country is home to a large part of ethnic Estonian Russian minority. Well, once this operation is completed, the Kremlin threatens to continue the war if an agreement is not reached, an agreement that may include the handover of Ukraine. Another alternative that Moscow could consider, if necessary, would be to attack the Suwałki corridor, the narrow strip of land that separates Kaliningrad from Belarus. The procedure would be basically the same. Well, along with eastern Estonia, this is another one of the potentially hottest spots in all of Europe. The point is that by means of the operation we have just described, Putin would be able to turn the tables. Suddenly, he would be in a very advantageous negotiating position. Think about it. What would prevent him from doing so? Oh right, Article 5 of NATO. But guess what? There is the problem. Without the United States, the nuclear umbrella disappears. So automatically, Article 5 would essentially comprise a conventional war response, an old-fashioned war that would be fought in European countries, not in Russia. So remember that Moscow does have a huge nuclear arsenal at its disposal, enough to deter any aggression. So NATO would find itself in a terribly compromised situation. It could go to war with Russia, but this battle will be fought in the Baltics, and perhaps also in Romania, Bulgaria, or Poland. Yes, it is virtually certain that the European NATO countries would eventually prevail, and that, of course, would mean a few tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Russian casualties. But in the eyes of the Kremlin, who cares? Putin has already shown that soldiers are nothing more than meat ready to put in the grinder. The most important thing is the Russian motherland. And if the price to pay for getting his way is a few 100,000 lives, that's a price he's surely willing to accept. Europeans, on the other hand, would have a much more difficult time. Along the way, we would see hundreds of thousands of dead, millions of refugees, and European cities razed to the ground, just like what has happened in Mariupol and Bakhmut. To avoid that terrible scenario, the other option would be to negotiate with Putin and agree to a ceasefire, which would perhaps include even the return of eastern Estonia. But, of course, that would not be for free. At the very least, the Kremlin would ask for the absolute and total surrender of Ukraine. And let's be honest, it is very likely that, under such circumstances, it would eventually get the prize.
Putin and Russia understand that they cannot defeat NATO militarily. They can only defeat NATO politically.
What can I say? There would be no shortage of arguments. Why risk having to face another full-scale war in Europe over a handful of square kilometers in Estonia, or over a country like Ukraine that is already destroyed? Wouldn't it be better for everyone to negotiate peace with Putin and get back access to cheap gas in the process? Do we really want to risk seeing the medieval centers of cities like Tallinn or Vilnius under artillery fire? VisualPolitik community. In this way, Putin would go down in history as the leader who made Russia great again. The leader who would have destroyed the Atlantic relationship for years, and who, on top of everything, would have returned Ukraine to the motherland. Let's remember that not even Peter the Great achieved so much. And you know how much Putin likes history. Okay, this would be the most extreme scenario, but a hybrid war with lots and lots of voltage would not be out of the question either, and the outcome might not be much different. The point is that, so far, this scenario has been completely impossible, and that basically comes down to one reason: the enormous firepower and the immense nuclear umbrella of the United States. Without that nuclear umbrella, and without that enormous firepower, the military spending of European countries is practically worthless. That is why Trump's words are far more serious than mere buffoonery. If, as president, he were to cast doubt on US backing, that alone could encourage Moscow to take the plunge. In other words, Trump's words remove nuclear deterrence, the key factor that for decades has prevented full-scale wars between NATO countries and the Soviet Union from the equation. And keep in mind that in a conventional war on European soil, Russia would always have the upper hand. Yes, as we've already said, in the long run, Moscow would lose the war and would have to retreat to its original borders. But occupying Estonia, Lithuania, or the Suwałki corridor would not be its end goal. The true objective would be to put so much pressure and so much fear on the Europeans that they would finally agree to negotiate. But wait a minute, I'm sure that some of you are thinking that we have forgotten something very important, that there are two European countries that do have nuclear weapons, France and the UK. The United Kingdom has some 200 nuclear warheads, and France around 300. Are these nuclear arsenals not in themselves a sufficient deterrent force? Well, I'm sorry to say it, but these days, they're not. The problem is not that they are much smaller than the Russian weapons, but more importantly, that currently the legislation of these two countries only allows the use of these weapons in the case of a direct threat to national defense. That is, if the United Kingdom or France were directly attacked. In recent times, there has been some talk to try to change this so that these weapons could defend the entire continent, much as the United States has done so far. The question is whether the UK or France, and especially the British and French, would really be willing to risk a nuclear exchange with Russia, because of what might happen in an Eastern European country like Estonia, Lithuania, Poland or Romania. And even if the legislation were changed, would they really dare to press the button? Keep in mind one thing, doubts by themselves are a risk. They erode the power of deterrence. And don't forget that Putin is a gambler who likes to bet big if he sees the slightest opportunity. Anyway, whatever the future may be, this is not the case today. And since other European countries do not have atomic weapons, not least because Washington put up its nuclear umbrella to gain influence and avoid massive nuclear proliferation, conventional war would be the result. Without the United States, the chances of a confrontation with Russia multiply. It is a simple matter of game theory that Putin might be interested in exploiting. But wait a minute, is all that we are telling you really a likely scenario? I bet some of you are thinking, bah, all this is nothing but a load of hot air from these guys from VisualPolitik. They're catastrophizing. Well, no, I'm sorry to say it, but no. All this is not something that we just came up with after one crazy night. It's a scenario that is gaining more and more weight within Europe. Don't believe me? Well, just take a look.
Russia could attack a NATO country within 3 to 5 years, warns Denmark. There is now a window that may last for 1, 2, or maybe 3 years, a time during which we must invest even more in good defense.
And keep in mind that it's not just Denmark and Norway. Sweden's Civil Defense Minister Carl-Oskar Bolin has gone so far as to say, and I quote verbatim, "Let me say it with the power of the office, there could be war in Sweden." In fact, he has even asked the municipalities to make contingency plans. Meanwhile, in December of 2023, the head of Poland's National Security Office said that NATO's eastern flank has only 3 years to prepare for confrontation. And for their part, analysts in Romania, the UK, and Ukraine are pointing in exactly the same direction. In fact, the Bundeswehr, the German armed forces, is already preparing some combat scenarios along the same lines. And pay attention because even for many analysts, the US nuclear umbrella might not be enough. Why? Because in the face of political anxiety, Putin could understand that a limited attack on a limited target, such as eastern Estonia, might cause NATO to prefer to negotiate before unleashing a nuclear storm. Let us say it again, it is a matter of game theory. Of course, this potential threat is being taken most seriously in the Baltic republics. In fact, that's what explains news items like this.
There will be 600 bunkers in the border areas of Estonia.
This is not a crazy project, but a firm decision. Estonia, a member country of the European Union, is going to build hundreds of bunkers along its border with Russia. And along with these facilities, which will begin construction in early 2025, the deployment of many defense weapons is included. Dragon teeth, complex barbed wire, anti-tank missiles, mines against armor, artillery, and a lot of devices of all kinds.
Russia's war in Ukraine has shown that, in addition to equipment, ammunition, and manpower, we also need physical defense facilities on the border to protect Estonia from the first meter.
And obviously, it's not just Estonia. Latvia and Lithuania have also agreed to build a huge network of bunkers and defenses along their borders with Russia and Belarus. And it goes even further. In 2023, Latvia, which had been the only Baltic republic without it, restored compulsory military service. And Lithuania is approving huge purchases of military equipment, including a large package to get hold of dozens of state-of-the-art Leopard 2s. These are just a few examples of the many actions being taken by these 3 small republics that are ramping up their military spending. Of course, given their small size and capacity, they could hardly put up much resistance in the event of a massive invasion. By the way, do you remember that here on VisualPolitik, we've already told you about the gigantic effort that Poland is making to catch up and build the largest land army in Europe? Well, it has to do precisely with all that we are telling you about in this video. Now, the question is, what can be done to deter or prevent a Russian attack? Well, we're going to take a look at that right now.
The way forward.
VisualPolitik community, what we have told you so far is neither fantasy nor an exercise in science fiction. It is the risk, the very real threat facing Eastern Europe. Yes, Ukraine is not winning this war. Unless it strikes a blow and weakens Moscow, NATO territory may be the next target on the Kremlin's roadmap. Of course, the risk would be even greater if Donald Trump managed to return to the White House. This is precisely the fear right now in the Baltics. Because the problem is that at this point in time, Europe is not ready for war, neither in terms of equipment, nor in terms of ammunition, nor in terms of military production. Look, for example, at what this former Belgian army officer tells us.
If war breaks out here, we will have to throw stones after only a few hours because of the shortage of ammunition.
It couldn't be clearer. Another example we had in 2023. The European Union pledged to deliver to Ukraine 1 million artillery shells over the past year, but in the end was only able to deliver about 300,000. In other words, Russia's economy is the same size as Italy's, but the Kremlin's prioritizing has meant that the country is producing more artillery shells than all the countries of the European Union put together. And that's not all. As far as the number of military personnel is concerned, the size of the Russian army could exceed 3 million, including reservists, while in the case of the EU, this figure is reduced to around 1.3 million. Okay, as we've already told you, in the long run, the industrial, economic, and technological capacity of European countries would prevail. But remember what we have seen. Moscow's idea would not be that the war would be settled on the battlefield. I don't know, just imagine for instance, would the leader of your country be willing to send troops to defend Estonia and face demonstrations in all your country's public spaces? Or maybe the No to War protesters would take to the streets again? You can decide for yourselves, but I think there are many places in Europe where the answer is clear. In any case, many governments now want to reverse this situation at all costs, but changes are still taking place way too slowly.
Europe is not only unprepared for war, it is not preparing for war. In Europe, we have a defense industrial capability largely designed for peacetime.
Correcting this situation would require two things: money and time. Or rather, a lot of money and a lot of time. 5 to 10 years at least. What could be done to avoid the worst case scenario? Well, there are basically 3 things you can do. First, support Ukraine and get Ukraine to weaken and defeat Russian troops. Second, we must improve coordination, ammunition stocks, the amount of equipment, and above all, the industrial base of European countries. Money must be made available, and it must be made available now. It's all very well spending hundreds of billions on the very green and eco-focused next-generation pandemic recovery fund, but ensuring safety should be the #1 priority. Well, here the European Union could help by issuing bonds and providing financing on favorable terms to EU members so that they could boost their defense capabilities with European production, thus providing an incentive for a military-industrial fabric that today seems to have disappeared or is run down. Following that, a plan could be established for them to repay these funds over a comfortable period of 10, 15, or 20 years. This is one possibility amongst many. Thus, according to some experts, in terms of military production, within 2 to 3 years, with sufficient investment, European countries could catch up. And thirdly, to copy the model of some European countries such as Finland.
We have a very strong Air Force, Army, and Navy, including, of course, weaponry including the biggest artillery in Europe along with Poland.
Finland, a country bordering Russia and a recent NATO member, has been preparing to defend itself against Russia for years. But it's not just about weapons. Finland, a country of just 5.5 million people, has 900,000 citizens with military training. Another example would be the Estonian Defense League, a voluntary military organization that is preparing to face a possible Russian invasion. Established in 1990 after liberation from the Soviet Union, this military reserve has a force of 18,000 troops who undergo continuous training and keep rifles and machine guns in their own homes. Well, reinforcing these types of forces, at least in Central and Eastern European countries, could be a good idea to stop any nefarious moves by Russia. For now, Vladimir Putin insists that the idea of attacking NATO is ridiculous. The problem is that he once said exactly the same thing about Ukraine. And then the Russian invasion was also thought to be completely far-fetched.
We have forgotten that in reality, peace is a rare thing when we look back in human history, and that in reality, war has been a constant part of our history for millennia.
Have non-proliferation agreements been a shot in the foot for countries like Germany and Poland? Could Trump shatter the Atlantic Alliance? Well, for now, only along the Russian borderlands these questions resound loudly. In Western Europe, this matter still sounds like a movie script for many people. But for now, it's your turn. How would you avoid the risk of a clash with Russia? What do you think the European Union should do? Leave us your answers in the comments and let's start a debate. And if you found this video interesting, please do us a huge favor by hitting that like button. Thank you very much for watching. All the best. See you next time.